Congratulations on your 145th anniversary. How many of you were here for the founding? 1880, is that correct? 1880. Just for fun, and to give me context, I want to know who has been a member of this church for a long time, and, who has been a member of this church for a long time? Let's see. Just going to check. There we go. It's back. Maybe the Lord didn't want me to ask you this question, but I'm going to try again. Who has been a member of this church for a long time? So if you've been a member of this church for, say, a lifetime or more than 50 years, raise your hand. Okay. Has anybody been a member of this church since before 1957? Okay. Anybody been a member of the church since the 70s? 80s? Oh wait, I got 70s? Yes. 80s? 90s? 2000s? 2000s? Okay, a lot of you. 2010s? Okay. Last 5 years? All right. Last 3 years? Last 5 minutes? Okay. So this is wonderful, actually. This, by the way, is an example of health and strength in a congregation, that you have people who were members for a long time, and you have people who have joined relatively recently, and you have a healthy mix. That is a good sign. But I'm going to spend a little time with you today on your history, which you may not know is your history. You are part of a denomination called the United Church of Christ that was founded in 1957. This church is obviously much older than 1957. When the UCC was founded, it merged two different traditions in the United States. It was the Congregational and Christian churches in the United States, and the German Evangelical and Reform. That is y'all's side of the family tree. The Congregationalists, by the way, were the people who came over on the Mayflower. They were seeking religious freedom from England via Holland. They get here, they come to New England early on. They come out to the Midwest in droves in the 1800s, and they set up churches that have names like First Congregational, Second Congregational, and if they were feeling like super feisty, Mayflower, Pilgrim, or Plymouth. Those are the Congregational churches. Later waves of immigration bring German farmers who come to the Midwest, and they start these evangelical and reform churches. And who were they back in Germany? They were the folks in Germany when the Protestant Reformation happened who did not become Lutheran. All right? So remember your Reformation history? You probably were studying it just last night in preparation for this big event. But just a little reminder is the Reformers, everybody was Catholic pretty much, and the Reformers had the radical idea that regular people like you and me should be able to read scripture in our own language and for ourselves, and they risked their lives of being burned at the stake so that we could do that. One reformer was Martin Luther, and he went on and founded the Lutheran Church of Germany, and there's various varieties of Lutheranism in America as well. But there were also reformers who we call the Reform side of the tradition, and that was John Calvin and Zwingli and people like that. And they were a little bit different kind of Reformation than Luther, and some of them were in Germany. Everybody up on that? So y'all were the not Lutheran Germans who came here. You're probably farmers at some point. This is the heritage, right? And they would have their services in German here in the United States. Now, For these early German churches in the ENR side, they were immigrant churches, so they would hold their services in German, provide support for immigrants. The topic of immigration is never far from us in this country or in the life of the Christian church, and immigrant churches have always been a powerful force for good, helping people to come into a community. And so these churches probably would have had German-speaking services until what? Yeah, what would have made that awkward for German people to worship in German? Around that time, you see transitions of churches not having their German language services in the same way, because they also experienced suspicion and prejudice if they did, because the thought was, are you patriotic? I know you have veterans in this congregation who were first-generation German and then served and fought for the Allies in World War II. That is a part of this church's story. And you may say, well, I just joined this church a couple of years ago and I don't know about any of that. But when you join a church, I really believe that history is almost in the bones of the building. And the beautiful parts of the history, we can all adopt like family. I don't speak a word of German, and yet I embrace that part of the family tree that had that struggle. Blessed are the poor. That's who those German immigrants were when they came to this country. They were not poor in spirit, they were poor as in they did not have much material means. They were later waves of immigrants. Others had already come. And if you go to Iowa or a lot of our places in Michigan, you will see in every farm town, but particularly this was the case in Iowa, every farm town would have a beautiful, beautiful church on a hill, magnificent and tall. One town it would be German Catholic, and the next town it would be German Protestant. And these were people without wealth and means, but they built these magnificent structures. And when I visit our German heritage churches in Michigan, a lot of times there are multi-generational families who will say, my grandfather worked on that piece of woodwork there. Because often if they were not farmers, they were the bricklayers, or they were the masons, or they did the carpentry. Those German churches had stained glass windows. The early Congregationalists did not. They liked the plain style. The early German churches, spoke German. They had the Herr Pastor. I did not know a lot about the German history of our churches, again, until I became a conference minister. I had served churches that were in that congregational side of the church. And so when I came to Michigan, I learned about it, and I feel there is a different feeling in these churches. These were people of the land, they were workers, and they were doers. Your heritage that you have embraced, by the way, whether you know it or not, is strong lay leadership. A lot of times those German churches would not have pastors, or the pastors would come and go. It was the people who had to keep the ministry going. They could not presume to have a steady stream of clergy because of their immigrant nature of these communities. Many times they had to grow up their own preachers among them. The church and the ministry were theirs as it is yours, and you know that. Pastors, we may come and go, but the body of Christ remains. This is what we celebrate when we celebrate 145th anniversary, and we look back at stories in the life of the church, and we imagine the real people who were the members, not the parade of pictures of clergy on the wall, but the real people who fixed the roofs and fed the hungry. In the church that I used to serve in Dubuque, Iowa, we celebrated our 175th anniversary, and we went back and read all these minutes of meetings, and we found amazing things that with the board of deacons, that's what the leaders were called at that time, what they had to contend with and what they had to deal with and the decisions they had to make. And it wasn't the pastors making decisions, it was the people. Like one amazing story that was covered in all the church minutes was the day back like over 100 years ago when a wealthy member of the church got drunk and rode his horse through the front door of the church on a Sunday morning and entirely disrupted worship. Because they were church, what did they respond? They probably were all like really polite while it was happening, like they just kept singing the hymn, but later they had a meeting about it. Because you're not just gonna let that go. And they have a meeting about it, and in the minutes it's recorded where they debate what to do. And apparently this wasn't the first time this guy behaved this way. And so they end up taking the radical step of asking him to seek his spiritual perfection somewhere else. That's pretty radical. And so he moved out of Dubuque to another town that's like 20 minutes away, Makokata, and he helped him get going with the congregational church there, and he became a leader of it, and ended up he becomes one of the wealthiest men in the area. But he and his horse sought their perfection elsewhere. These are the real stories of real people in real churches trying to be faithful. I recently had the opportunity, representing the Michigan Conference, to visit Germany and meet our German partners. So one of the things I learned about the church in Germany is that today it is sponsored by the state. So the church is hard for us to understand in the United States, where we have a sort of free market system of our religious landscape. But in Germany, part of the Reformation history about whether you were Lutheran or evangelical and Reform or this and that, it really, to be honest, had to do with dukes and emperors and the powers that be. So if, I was a duke of a certain area and there was a rival duke over here and he was Lutheran, then I would make all my people be Reform. So that early grassroots rebellion of the Reformation soon gets sort of codified in the structures of power and politics, as can happen. And so sometimes these regions, they think, well, we're Catholic and then we're Lutheran, but now this duke says we're this. And it reminds me a little bit of the story that you all told me this morning. Some people remember that in 1957, after the UCC is founded, at some point in this church, the pastor came in and said, we are no longer considered an evangelical and Reformed church. We are now a United Church of Christ. To which everybody said, well, that's a game changer. I'll try to keep my eyes open. What difference does it make ultimately? It makes some difference in who our church family is, but ultimately, this is the Church of Jesus Christ in whatever iteration. And so for those German churches, though, their sense of history goes even deeper than ours because it goes back so many hundreds of years. Different regions of our denomination in the United States were partnered with different regions in Germany. And I had never been to Germany in my life before. I don't speak German. And our region, apparently, in Michigan, was what's called Pomerania, or the Pomeranian church back in the day. But if you want to picture it, it's part of what we formerly called East Germany. And it's up there way north, and you're looking over there. They're looking across that Baltic Sea. They're way up there. It's cold, and they're looking across that Baltic Sea at Denmark, Norway. That's the region that we in Michigan were partnered with. Those folks are fishermen. They're fishermen. Fishermen in that tough sense of being a fisherman, where you're out there in the cold and the ice. And you're out there, and they probably had more in common culturally with Scandinavia This is where the Vikings came into Germany and there was all the back and forth. These people were the fishermen, and this was their churches in Pomerania. And later, in the Cold War, they are the ones who are in the Eastern Bloc and under a communist dictatorship. Traditionally in Germany, I learned when I went to visit, this is an area of the country that feels as though they have been visited by more of the woes than the blessings. These are the people historically who did experience poverty and hunger. Did they feel blessed? Other parts of Germany, Berlin, the big cities, Western Germany, different story. But there are always, in any place and time, people who feel like they get more blessings or they get more woes. And it's to these people that Jesus spoke and said, "Blessed are you who are poor." Not in spirit. Like, blessed are you in the pain of not having as much. For yours will be the kingdom of heaven. And similarly, the woe upon you who are rich, for you have already experienced your consolation. And to me, that is the most chilling and damning thing he says. Because think about it, if you are poor economically, you know that the life of the Spirit has more depth, there is more to life than what you accumulate in your bank account and you do for others. Historically, those who are poor economically tend to be much more generous. That's just a given. They know something spiritually that others do not. But for those who are rich, you have already experienced your consolation, meaning this is as good as it gets for you. It doesn't get better for you if you are rich, because you have placed your trust here, and this is all it is. But blessed are those who are poor. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. When I visited the churches in Germany, I had been told by a number of people, "Don't worry, Lillian, everybody over there speaks English." As it turns out, this was not true. Just as we all make assumptions about, oh, America's this way or that, I learned that, of course, Germany is a very complicated place, and where I was going, as it turns out, not everybody spoke German. People had told me before I went, other people in the United Church of Christ in the church said, "Oh, everyone will love to speak English with you, and if they don't, they'll have headsets for you, and everything will be translated." Again, it was just a barrel of lies to trick me into going. And so I get there, and I'm picked up, and this reality comes up to me. And I'm sent out, I'm dropped off at this hotel that's out kind of in the middle of nowhere. And it wasn't walking distance to nothing. They took me later to that. But it was out by a gas station, and they said, "We've arranged for you to join a tour group to have dinner." And none of them seemed to speak English either. And I thought, where have I ended up? And the next day, they took me into this beautiful historic town. And this town, my friends, was Greifswald is what it's called, is the seat of a university that was founded in the 1400s. Can you imagine a university founded in the 1400s? And some of those buildings, and there's a river and it goes out to the Baltic Sea, and the culture that was here. And then the reformers come into these churches and you see their portraits. And then to think that they went through communism. And so much of this area, the buildings, the historic buildings, were torn down and replaced by those Soviet-style 50s and 60s concrete apartment buildings. These were people who were poor, not in spirit, but economically so. In those times, as people remembered it, as I did get to know people, and occasionally somebody would try to translate or explain something, They said, we are not like the people in the rest of Germany who all learned English and had all that education. We were left behind here. But they said we did have jobs and we knew each other. But the churches were suppressed. They have these beautiful ancient buildings and they had no pastors for decades. The way it worked in Germany, as I told you, is it was a state-supported religion. And so in the other parts of Germany, you would have a pastor in a church like this, but it was funded by the government. It still is, by the way. So on your taxes, if you're a German citizen, you can check off that you are a Christian, you can say Protestant or Catholic, and some portion of your taxes go to this institution, and they put pastors into churches like this, and they pay them like a public school teacher would be paid. As I was visiting them, I found myself envious of this system. I thought how amazing it would be for us in the United Church of Christ, as we're trying to help churches find clergy, as we're trying to encourage a spirit of vocation in the midst of a clergy shortage. How amazing it would be if I could guarantee that the government would pay the salary of your next pastor. I was envious. I felt poor in comparison to those German churches today. But what I also learned is those German churches are empty. They may have a pastor who is paid like a public school teacher, but that pastor may look out and see 3 people. That pastor may be teaching a religion course in the public school. That's an interesting concept too. They have huge levels of hierarchy, so they wanted me to go to meetings with all these people who seemed to have jobs similar to mine, except there were like 1,000 of them. And they'd say, what do you have in your structure in Michigan? It was just a handful of us, you know. Y'all here at St. John's, you've met half of us. But for them, they had buildings and institutions and all these things, but it didn't feel like they had this. Because the people didn't have to do this heavy lifting. Until we went one night to a church out in a remote area, beautiful rural area, rolling hills, and this was one of those churches that was built in the 1600s, and it was brick and half falling down, but stunningly beautiful. And we went there with a quartet of singers who were visiting from South Africa. So you had 4 black South African men and a conference minister from Michigan riding in a van out into the country to this church for an evening concert, where the church members, when we arrived, a group of maybe 25, had set up tables outside in the cold night air. And there were sandwiches and cookies and a few refreshments. And as we walked up, it was awkward because no one spoke to us. And later I found out it was because they did not speak English. And we found our way into this church, and if you needed to use the bathroom, they had to walk you 1.5 blocks away to another building because this church had no bathroom. It had very little electricity, and yet it had been there since the 1600s. And as these South African men sang in English or Swahili or Afrikaans, and these people from Germany listened, I felt a sense of being part of a church family that was bigger and older and more important than me. Afterwards, a few of the church members came up and they said, in very broken English, "We are ashamed that we can't speak to you, because we were not taught English. We were part of the group that felt passed over in these waves. And later with the reunification, we lost the jobs we had. We have never had pastors for this church. We don't speak the language." And I felt ashamed for the ways in which in wealthy United States of America, I don't know how to speak other languages in the way that the rest of the world does. But ultimately, there was no shame in any of it. It became this enormous blessing. And what was remarkable is this group of people who gathered for the concert and then sat outside only to be illuminated by the night sky, for there was no electricity, stayed not for an hour and a half, but 2 hours fellowshipping when we couldn't understand each other. But what we could understand is the person insisting we have another cookie, and the South African singers laughing with some people they found who were their age. And they said, we came all the way from South Africa and we haven't met any German women. And these young men said, we've got you. This is the blessed tradition we stand in. Whether you are brand new to this church or a lifetime member, blessed are you who find your blessing in the unexpected places of the world. Amen.